Okay, hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you might be. I see we have people participating from literally all over the world today, so it's getting exciting. Very big crowd, and pretty early from where I'm broadcasting. I hope everybody is awake. We're broadcasting from our makeshift studio here again. Hopefully this won't be a permanent situation, but it's worked out okay so far, so we'll keep doing that. So I see people are filing in. Got my control center over here. I'll try to monitor what's going on, and I have a moderator who will help me monitor questions and so on. So that should work out pretty good. So let's get started with the content at hand, because we got a lot of stuff to talk about today. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Markus Egger. I'm the President and Chief Software Architect of EPS Software Corporation, also known for our code brands like Code Consulting, Code Magazine, and a number of other things like that. What I do most of the time is probably just like you guys. I write a lot of production code. That's where the majority of my time goes these days. But in addition to that, I do a lot of presentations, speaking at various events, online these days, of course, but hopefully also live events again. Also a Microsoft Regional Director. I want to explain really quick what that means. That means I have an official relationship with Microsoft, but I am not, and this is very important, I'm not a Microsoft employee. So that means I have a lot of inside info, but I can also say whatever I want. I'm not having to do the Microsoft shtick, so to speak. And that's exactly what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to pass on information that I have and give you an honest opinion about things without having to do Microsoft marketing or anything like that. You can contact me, markus@epssoftware.com. I'll have a slide at the end. You're all going to get the slide deck of this. But feel free to contact me if you have any questions about this content or anything else. Now, this is not going to be very marketing-y, but my marketing people tell me I have to show at least a marketing slide or two. So here we go. This is who we are. Code and EPS Software is a company that helps people build better software. We do that in a variety of ways. We are a custom software development shop. We do a lot of training, mentoring, so we can help you building your application. We do so on the web, desktop, mobile, cloud, of course, databases, and so on, the whole 9 yards. So if you have any need for any of that, we do project rescue, we do UI design, we do different languages, we do staff augmentation, and so on. So if you have any needs like that, feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to help you out with that. And a lot of times when people come to presentations like this, then somebody says online, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? I hope so. It should be on. Anyway, a lot of people after this presentation always ask me, well, how does this apply to me? I heard the presentation and that's great in general, but here's our specific situation. What do we do with that? And for that scenario, we have this particular offering here, a free hour of consulting or thereabout. If it takes a little longer, that's fine too. There's no string attached. It really is exactly what it looks like here. We are a very community-driven company. So if you have any question like that, contact us for the free hour of consulting. And people now say online they can hear me, so that's good. Also, make sure you follow us on social networks. Feel free to share this information. It's always great when people share this, get a little more community involvement going and so on. So that we are on Twitter as Code Magazine, we're on Facebook as Code Magazine. There's also state-of.net specific Twitter and Facebook accounts that we usually post to as well, but most of the stuff is on the Code Magazine social feeds. Okay. Now that's it for the marketing. Here's what we're doing with Stata.net. A lot of you may know Stata.net as live events where we go from city to city and usually either at Microsoft offices or at some hotel or convention center do these live Stata.net presentations. Due to the coronavirus crisis, we had to change that. We're now doing it monthly online, slightly different format. Each monthly session focuses on a specific topic. We are going to continue doing that. It has worked out really well. We've now done the third one and gotten a lot of great feedback on that. So we will continue doing that as a monthly feature. But we do also intend to return to the live event format in addition as soon as that is possible again. So in a sense, this gave us an opportunity to grow things, and that's worked out good. And we'll continue to do both. So spread the love, tell people this is happening. That's, I think, a cool thing. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Blazor. We're going to talk about what Blazor is. We're going to talk about what to expect. We're going to talk about what we see in the marketplace. We're going to do an overview of what Blazor means both on the client and the server. And client side will be the majority of this talk, but we'll also talk a little bit about the server side things for Blazor as well. Now, before we can get into that, we have to look at what WebAssembly is and what that means, and different ways of using WebAssembly. So we'll start out with a few slides, but then probably the easiest way to explain Blazor and to show it is to show code examples. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. So today is going to be fairly sample heavy. So those of you who like to see code and code samples, this is your kind of presentation. Now, one more thing. We really need your help on something here. So I'm asking you to help me out with something. And that is, we are trying to figure out what kinds of things people want to see in these Stata.NET events. So we put together a very, very simple little questionnaire that you can get to at this URL here. We'll also send out that URL later. It's a quick 9 questions, basically saying how much do you like this? What kinds of things do you want to see? And that helps us plan future events. So you could really help me out by doing this. And we're also raffling off a $100 gift certificate for everyone who basically takes this by 6/26. And again, we're not going to use this for marketing in any way that we're going to sell your name or anything. We just would like some information to help us plan future events a little bit better. Okay, now with that, let's dive right in. And let's see what this Blazor thing is all about. So the short version is, Blazor is a new web development framework from Microsoft. And usually when I say that, the first reaction that I get from people is, well, why on earth would we need another web development framework? We get a new web development framework once a week. They're usually JavaScript frameworks, highly in flux. Why would I need yet another one? Well, the simple answer to that is, this one is truly different. Unlike all the other web development frameworks, this one is based on the .NET platform. So that may or may not appeal to you. If it doesn't appeal to you, then Blazor may not be for you. But if it appeals to you that you can use .NET technologies that are very stable and that will be around for a long time and that will move forward relatively gradually, then this might just be the framework for you. And I'll also be honest about this. We don't really know how much the market is going to take to Blazor. Now, I can tell you this, we get a lot of interest for training, for the magazine, even for this event. This event has the biggest crowd of any of the Stata.NET events we've done. So we see a lot of momentum behind Blazor, but it remains to be seen how this will work out, if the market will really take to it or not. But it looks really good at this point, and personally, I'm very excited about it. Now, I'm mostly excited about the client-side framework. There's 2 different ways of doing Blazor. One's on the client, one's on the server. It really started as a client thing. And then Microsoft also made a server-side version of it that hits a little bit of a broader audience even. And they released that first because it was much easier to do. And now the client-side framework is released as well. And that's what I'm personally really excited about. It's really nice that we have the server and the client, and we can go both ways and even switch back and forth between the two. But the client is, I think, what is really, really exciting. And essentially what we are talking about is running .NET code in the client. Now you're going to say, well, .NET code in the client, that's going to be a proprietary thing. And it's going to be another Silverlight and it's only going to run on certain platforms. That is absolutely not the case. So Blazor uses all web standards, and when you run .NET code on the client, it runs in pretty much any browser, and I'll give you an exact list, but you can essentially assume it'll run everywhere. So this is fundamentally different from other client-side frameworks that are based on JavaScript. There's many different JavaScript frameworks available. They all have one thing in common. Obviously, they use JavaScript. And when you think about that, that's a very odd situation. I mean, in computing in general, we all agree that different languages are good at different things. And some people love JavaScript and other people do not. And some people like me, I love JavaScript for certain types of things, but not for others, because different languages that I'm familiar with have different benefits and advantages. So it's really nice that with frameworks like Blazor, and there will be others in the future, I'm guessing, you now have a choice of language on the client side as well. So you can choose to work with JavaScript when you want, and you can choose to work with .NET and C# in other scenarios. So that's really exciting. Let's take a look at some of the specific Blazor advantages. So like I said, first of all, it uses C# as the language. What it does is it essentially compiles C# into a format that can run inside the browser on this technology or this standard called WebAssembly. Now there's a little more to it, and this is highly simplified, but essentially that's how you can think of it. It's C# in the browser, equal to what you would see with something like JavaScript. So really, really nice that we're opening up the browser for multiple languages. As I said, I think in the future, we'll see more of that. Now, what it means is that we don't just get C# as the language, but we also get great tooling. We get Visual Studio, we get Visual Studio Code, we get all the other IDEs that can write C# code, and there are many at this point. And all that tooling works for Blazor and therefore for this new web development framework. So a very, very rich environment that we get out of that. We get stability. One of the great things about .NET is that it is evolved gradually. The C# language now goes back almost 20 years or more than 20 years, and it has been stable. You can still use the same C# code, and it will continue growing like that. Also, the same is true for the framework itself. Yes, ASP.NET changes quite a bit, but overall, .NET changes less in breaking ways than other frameworks do. So stability is a great goal with this. And one of the advantages and one of the goals for Blazor definitely is to get out of this treadmill of picking some kind of JavaScript framework, and 2 months later, you basically picked the wrong thing because the last great new thing came out and everybody's laughing at you for picking the old thing. So that insanity is one thing that we're trying to address, so that Microsoft's trying to address with Blazor. As a question online, does Blazor support the .NET framework or just .NET Core? That's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. When you're doing Blazor development, you're essentially doing .NET Core development, but you can bring in other assemblies. So you can bring in assemblies that are based on .NET Standard. You can bring in a lot of the older stuff. I'll show you some of the examples. But fundamentally, it's a .NET Core technology, or in the future, it will be a .NET 5 technology, .NET 6 technology. So it is on that latest version of the .NET platform, but you still get a lot of reuse of the older code. And I'll show you how to bring in some older components as we get to those samples. Being on .NET gives us a great ecosystem. It's not just the stuff Microsoft does. It's also about the stuff that A, the open source community does, and B, a lot of the vendors do. So what we see already is that there's a lot of movement in those areas, and there's already a lot of vendors that are providing commercial components. There's a lot of stuff available in the open source community. So all of that is fair game. A lot of the things that used to be out there are fair game. And of course, that makes for a great big ecosystem. Now, very important, it is based on standards. It's based on HTML, it's based on CSS, and it's based on the standard called WebAssembly that we'll talk about quite a bit today. Now, what this means is we're still using the same technologies that have been used for web development for a lot of this. The whole UI layer is still HTML. Blazor does not at all reinvent what's done with the UI itself. So when you put a button on the screen or some text, that's still HTML. It's not like Silverlight was in that sense, where it would replace what was there and build a new UI layer. So we're not doing that with Blazor. The only thing that's new is essentially the running of the code, the WebAssembly piece. And of course, just the way Microsoft makes the framework work, how components work and so on, sits on top of HTML, but it's all standard technologies. You get great code reuse and code share. So if you have an existing ASP.NET MVC app, if you have an existing WPF app, WinForms app, just class libraries and so on, chances are that you'll be able to reuse some or all of that code. Now, of course, if you're building a WPF app, you're not reusing the actual UI, but you can reuse the actual logic that's in there. So that's a great advantage. And if you build two different apps, maybe you're building a Windows app, maybe you're building something for the web, and maybe you're building a mobile app, chances are you can then take your business logic that is in a separate DLL or a separate NuGet package and reuse that in your Blazor application. So that is awesome. It's component-based. A lot of the UI frameworks are these days, but this falls right in line with this. And .NET has always been really good at building components. So I would argue that this is a very, very good component-based model. Question online is, how would I compare this to web forms? Well, it's totally different from web forms in the sense that this is a client-side framework. Now, if you use the server-side version, in a way, it is kind of a little bit like web forms. It's almost like update panel on steroids, but that really doesn't do it justice. The approach is quite a bit different. And on the client side, like I said, it's totally different from web forms because you're actually running the code in the browser. The browser really over time has become its own rich front-end technology. It's not such a thin client anymore in most cases. And this is just a way to use .NET code in that rich environment on the client. And you can even do it off-site. You can do things like progressive web apps. And I'll show you some samples of that. So in a way, kind of conceptually, the way you put things together, a little bit similar to web forms, but the component model is much more advanced. And the client-side runtime is quite a bit different. Question is, if Blazor is essentially .NET Core, will it be backwards compatible with the previous .NET Core libraries? So I'm assuming, can you bring in libraries? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. Another question is, can you still use Bootstrap on the client side when using Blazor? And yes, absolutely. You can use Bootstrap. You can use many of the other CSS and HTML things that you've always used, because at the end of the day, it produces HTML. And in fact, Bootstrap is even part of some of the default templates, but you could use others as well. Anyway, one more advantage that I think is really important is about skill reuse. If you are a seasoned .NET developer, or you have people in your shop that know a lot about .NET, they are probably going to be much more productive in a .NET-based environment than if you drag them into something completely new. And so the reuse of skill, I think, is something that tends to get overlooked, but I think it is super important in terms of productivity, in terms of expense of building something, and so on. Okay, one more question online. How secure is Blazor? Well, Blazor is as secure as any web technology. So you have the same protocols that are getting used. You're still calling services, most likely. It goes over HTTP, well, HTTPS, I would assume at this point. You're authenticating the same way. Now, a lot of that is hidden from you. So in that sense, it should be more secure out of the box. Or I shouldn't say hidden, but it's set up correctly for you from the get-go. But at the end of the day, you're using the same web security standards. Now, in many cases, you are deploying .NET DLLs into the browser. They're a little bit harder to look at than JavaScript code would be. So if you have anything where you're worried about people looking at your code, it might be a smidgen more secure. But at the end of the day, people could decompile that and so on. So it's just the hurdle got a little higher. But, you know, it is a little bit of a slightly more secure frame. But in general, it's very comparable to other web development frameworks. Okay, one more question here before I move on. How about Redux? Can you use Redux? I've not tried that. I don't think that's a really good match. But I have to admit, I've never tried using Redux with it. I guess conceptually you could probably do it. Again, it's just web standards, but I think it logically may not make that much sense to do it. But be an interesting question. Maybe I'll take a note here and I'll actually try it out on my own afterwards. So let's dive into this a bit more. First of all, what's very important to understand is that Blazor is really two different things. There's Blazor WebAssembly, which is the client-side framework. The WebAssembly framework just was released a few weeks ago, but it is released now, right? So a lot of people don't realize that. It's in production, it's fully supported, it's a released product. You can now use that for client-side development. There's also Blazor Server, which is the one that was released with .NET 3. That's been around for a while. Same exact development model, identical code bases for the most part, but it runs on the server and it communicates with the client over WebSockets. Very, very interesting that we can do that. You can basically switch between the two to some extent. But again, to me, the client-side framework is the one that's really interesting. Now, when I say there's identical code bases, that's fundamentally true. But if you run on the server, you may just be able to do certain things a little bit different. For instance, you may just be able to open a connection to SQL Server and get your data that way, which would not be advisable from the client. And so logically, there's some things that are a little bit different there. Security-wise, you may be able to do things on the server that you may not be able to do on the client. But those are fairly detailed things, right? Logistical things, just approach things. But fundamentally, the two technologies are the same. Question about which browser supported. I'll get to that here in a moment. Can you combine Blazor with other WebAssembly technologies like Rust and EMScript? Yes, you can, but it's not super easy at this point. And Microsoft says they're working on more things to make that easier in the future. Do browsers have difficulties with this? Mainly Edge. Edge can use Blazor very, very well. Blazor server is using a socket connection. Can we still use HTTP context? Are there performance concerns? Yeah, you can use HTTP context. You can, yeah, it's still based on open standards. Performance concerns, it takes a little bit longer to communicate back and forth and send these updates, but it's really very, very fast. It's amazingly fast. In general, when I use Signal R, which is the technology behind the scenes here, I'm always amazed how fast it really is. But yeah, I mean, it's faster if you don't have to make that round trip to the server. So here are a few of the more important features that Blazor has. You know, all the stuff that you would generally expect from a web framework, like routing, layout, validation, and so on, is there in Blazor. Okay, what versions do we have? Like I said, Blazor Server released with .NET Core 3. The more interesting one, Blazor WebAssembly, just released with the .NET Core SDK 3.1.3. So if you have anything older than 3.1.3, get that version. We're now a little bit past that, but anything from that version on will support it, and that's the released version. And it's of course supported in Visual Studio, VS Code, the command line interface, and so on. Okay. If you have any questions, by the way, if you need to download some of the stuff, Blazor.net is where you get it. That's where you can grab the right SDKs, add-ins, all kinds of stuff. There's also, by the way, great learning content on Blazor.net. So nice walkthroughs and so on. Because I cannot teach you all of Blazor here in today's session, I can just basically scratch the surface and whet your appetite for it. So that's a great resource. But then again, like I said, you can also at any point contact me or contact us if you have any questions about this stuff. Okay, before we get into code samples, let's talk about some of the underpinnings of this whole thing, because this is pretty important to understand. The most important thing when it comes to Blazor on the client is this standard called WebAssembly. What is WebAssembly? WebAssembly is a standard that is supported by just about any modern browser at this point. And it is a binary standard to essentially, if you want to think of it like that, run binary low-level code inside a web browser. Typically, when we talk about running code in a browser, we talk about JavaScript. So the browsers have different JavaScript execution engines. They take the JavaScript, compile it into some P code or something internal that is pretty close to binary, and then they execute that. WebAssembly is essentially a parallel way of executing code on the web, where you can take any language, and this started with C++, but you can take any language, compile it to this WebAssembly standard, and then run it pretty darn close to what a native assembly-based code base would be. It's not quite the same as true assembler or machine code on, say, a PC or a Mac, but it's very, very close to that, and it gets loaded and basically made ready to execute as it loads into different environments, whether that is a PC, a Mac, a mobile phone, an Android phone, iPhone, or even other things, right? So it's this binary standard that's native to these browsers. It provides near native performance on the web. So it's a great thing, and it provides this ability for any language provider to make their language compile to the web. So it opens up the whole web environment to the plethora of languages that we have in other systems. And that's a great thing, right? Because on a PC or on other platforms, you wouldn't just want to have to settle on one language and then everybody has to use that. The choice of languages is a great thing to have. And WebAssembly essentially brings that back to the browser. And it's now been around for a while. So it's not the new thing that we hope a lot of browsers will eventually support. It is now supported by all the important browsers. So that's what WebAssembly is in a nutshell. Here is kind of how all of that works. You have a bit of a binary base that gets compiled to a WASM file, and that then runs in the browser in parallel to other technologies like JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Just think of it as yet another language execution layer that works in the browser, and all the other technologies that you were familiar with in the browser are still there. Okay? So you're not losing anything, it's just yet another execution components. Okay, question online. Are you seeing custom uptake on the idea of new paid web apps with Blazor? Yeah, we absolutely do. So more and more of that is happening. Is it going to be the big wave that's here to stay, or is it just a fad? That I can't answer yet, but we're definitely seeing a lot of interest in the Blazor development scene. Can you create graphic applications like Paint? Well, again, Blazor is not a technology that replaces the UI layer. So you see a lot of Blazor components that do interesting UI stuff, and I have some samples later that'll show some charts. But that's using typically or always some standard HTML technology, whether that's just HTML and CSS, or whether that's vector images, or whether that's Canvas API or something like that. But you could absolutely drive that with your C# code if you want it. But the actual display of the UI has not changed. That's still the usual HTML-based technologies. Does WebAssembly work in iOS? Absolutely. Can it be used with Angular or React? Well, no, those are, well, yes and no. I mean, those are really different worlds. Now, you could theoretically load some C# code into that and then interop with it. That's not easy to do at this point. Blazor is really more than just providing you the code execution layer. It's also a framework that in essence replaces Angular. Now, you could combine the different, say, small areas of your app. One could be Angular, one could be Blazor, but it's technically possible, but it's difficult to combine. What about initial load time? We'll take a look at that. If the very first load time is a little bit hefty, it downloads a fair amount of stuff, but then the same is true for Angular or other apps as well. So it's comparable, I would say, but it's not exactly super thin. So if you need something really, really small and lean, then this is probably not for you. But in the real world, it's easily fast enough and small enough. So here's an overview of what browsers you can use. Essentially, all the modern browsers on all the platforms can use it. So you see the Edge Chromium browser, you see Chrome itself, you see the older Edge browser, Firefox, Opera, Safari. It works on all the platforms. You can use it on PC, Mac, Linux. You can use it on Android. You can use it on iOS. The one browser that you'll notice is missing here is the old Internet Explorer browser. So if that's the target that you need to go after, then you either can't use Blazor or you have to use Blazor server-side. But all the modern browsers that support the modern web standards they can run WebAssembly. And Internet Explorer, by the way, never will run WebAssembly. I don't think Microsoft's making any efforts in that direction. The question, would I recommend this for enterprise use at this point? And the answer is absolutely yes. Yeah, it's ready for that. So enterprise scenarios are probably one of the most common scenarios, actually. So here is how Blazor specifically works, just an overview of the environment before we get into demos. In Blazor, you have C# files. You have Razor files that are basically Razor pages. You can think of them as CS/HTML files. So typical .NET artifacts, they get compiled into .NET DLLs by the .NET build system. And there's a custom Razor compiler that does that. And so it then creates a DLL for your app. That is a standard .NET DLL. There's really nothing special about it. And then there is a core runtime. It's a mono-based runtime that itself runs on WebAssembly. So it's not actually that your components get compiled to native WebAssembly. Your components are standard .NET components, which means, well, your component is a standard .NET DLL, but it also means everything else you want to use can be a standard .NET DLL, and it should just work. And the main thing that is actually WebAssembly is a .NET runtime that sits on top of it. So it's really very similar to executing .NET on a PC or a Mac or a Linux environment, where you have your .NET runtime that is then executing the DLLs that sit on top of it, and then everything is back to working. And that gets loaded with a JavaScript-based bootstrapper, simple HTML setup. It loads all that stuff, and then that's how your components get loaded. And at that point, it's standard web technologies that's running your stuff and all the other JavaScript and HTML and CSS-based stuff. All right, enough slides. Let's actually dive into some demos. And the first thing I want to do is I just want to go into Visual Studio, and we'll just come in here and we'll start our first Blazor project. So I have the latest components installed. Most likely you get the auto updates anyway, and that should just be working. But so then you have the Blazor templates in here, so you can either search for it. I have it in my most recent template, so I'll just run with that. Here's my Blazor app. I can then give it a name, so we'll call this State of .NET Blazor. And I'll put it into this location. Go ahead and create that. And Visual Studio is always a little bit slow when you do a live presentation. So then the next thing it wants to know is, do we want to create a client-side or a server-side application? In our case, we're most interested in the client-side application here. You can then configure a few other things, like, you know, you should have an HTTPS enabled. You can decide that you want it to be hosted in a whole ASP.NET Core environment. If you also have server-side logic, maybe to get to data and create an API or something like that. We're not going to do that today, but you could integrate that here right away. You can also define that you want it to be a progressive web app, which would add some additional components. I'm going to turn that on for now. And then we'll go ahead and hit create. And this, as is typical for Visual Studio or .NET projects, creates a new project based on a standard template that puts in a few basic building blocks for us. So we have a starting point, so just sample pages basically. And it needs to pull in some NuGet packages. So it will do the package restore for us. And if you run this at home, it'll go a little bit faster. Like I said, when you do a screen share like this, Visual Studio is usually a little bit slower. Somebody's asking online, Blazor server app versus Blazor WebAssembly, which one is better for building a new web application? If you're building a web app, right, a typical application like an enterprise would run it, I would absolutely build a client-side application at this point, unless I had to support Internet Explorer. If I was to build a typical website, say an e-commerce site, a shopping cart, I don't know, it's maybe a little more of an open question. Maybe for a shopping cart, I wouldn't want to build a client-side app. I think the question is, do you want to build a single-page app, which would be the client-side Blazor model, or do you want to build something that's more like a website, and then it'd be more the server-side model, or maybe not Blazor at all? But anyway, here's our Blazor application. creates a few things for us like pages, has some regular web stuff like HTML files and so on. Let's just go ahead and let's fire this up. And so it compiles, make sure that it has all the packages restored, and it'll then launch a browser for us. Okay, and as I said, usually takes a moment or two. Okay, it goes, build succeeded. And if you're following along with this at home, you'll probably notice that it is long started in your environment while it's still going in mine. And there's our browser. It's fine. Okay, here we go. It's going to load our component from localhost, like with any other web application. So essentially what Visual Studio does is it just does a .NET run in the background. And here's our browser app. And this is plain old HTML. We could go into our dev tools. We could inspect some of this stuff. And you see we're dealing with regular HTML. And we can click around in this. It loads different pages. You see the navigation happening up here. We have an example that brings in some data. We have an example that does a simple counter. We can click this counter and it counts up a number. And it looks very much like a regular web application, which it is. The only major difference is that the code that's actually running when I click this button is .NET code, and it runs in the browser. Right? A lot of people see this, they think, oh, it just goes back to the server and it runs the code. No, it doesn't. This code actually runs in the browser. And again, if we bring up the dev tools, we can dig around a little bit in here. It's a little bit hidden, but we can see the actual things that it runs. We can go into the network tab and we can sometimes see it here. Let's do a reload. But it does a really, really good job at caching a lot of these things. But when I do a hard refresh like I did right here, you see it brings in all these different DLLs. Right? So these are just DLLs that this application happens to use. Now I had to kind of force that I see that. Normally it does this once, it does a super great job at testing and, at caching, and then it is really, really performant. And a lot of applications share all this stuff, of course. But if you did a total bare bones load the first time around, a Blazor app would be about 1.8 megs at a minimum. In development, in a debug build, you see a much higher load, but in production, you see about 1.8. You could get it down to about 1.6, Microsoft says, but that's about where you're at. And so, in a way, that's very similar to what you'd see in a typical Angular app. Okay, so let's see what this code actually looks like here. More questions online. Is it ready for containerized environment? Containers really don't play a big role in this. Containers would simply define what it's served up from. And yes, you could absolutely use containers. You don't even, you could use a static page essentially to serve up a Blazor app, and you could use containers for that. More likely, you would have an API layer that you get data from. That layer, of course, has nothing as such to do with Blazor. That would be just standard .NET or Node.js or whatever you build your backend with. And that could absolutely be in a container. There's no difference there, right? At the end of the day, we're dealing with a web application. Question, do you have to rebuild your project every time? Yes, it's a fully compiled project. You could do .NET Watch run, so it actually watches and reloads, just like an ASP app today. And they're actually working for future versions. They're working on hot reload scenarios. That's not in there yet. So it's more like building an ASP.NET app. Which IDE do I prefer? I use both Visual Studio and VS Code. I like VS Code a little bit better for editing, but Visual Studio has the better overall experience. I go back and forth between them. Can you publish an IIS, anything like that? Yes, absolutely. It's just standard web stuff, right? It just gets loaded over HTTP. Any web server will do. And there's a question about debugging. I'll actually take a look at debugging specifically in just a moment. So let's take a look at the setup of this app. I mean, first of all, we have an index.html page. That's the page that gets loaded. If Visual Studio will bring it up here for me. Come on, there we go. Okay, so that's the page that gets loaded. It's a very, very simple HTML page. You can load whatever you want in here. You see that the default template brings in Bootstrap, to go back to our prior question. But this is essentially a single page app, and the whole app is loaded where it has this app placeholder here. Okay? So that's where the whole app goes. That's where the framework will start loading different components. Now the components are things like a shared main layout that is used here. And this is a Razor page. So this is our first view at a Razor page. Razor pages are a combination of HTML and C# code. So CSHTML pages, essentially, if you're familiar with them. So pretty simple, you know, it loads a bunch of div tags. It does components. This is our first look at components here. So you can make a nav menu component, for instance, which is really just yet another Razor page. So that's the page that gets loaded as the menu, and the menu is simply a bunch of styled list items. Okay, so that's kind of how the setup works overall. When we then navigate around in the app, there's a routing component. Digging into those details will probably be a bit beyond what we want to talk about today. But the long story short, when you navigate around and you navigate to /counter, for instance, it navigates to this particular page. And as you can see, again, this is a combination of HTML and C#. First of all, it has a few interesting directives up here, like at the very top. It says, hey, routing framework, I want this component to be available as /counter. Okay, so when we go to /counter, it'll load this component into the app. And in here, we have standard HTML, like this H1 tag, but then we also have embedded C# code. So this displays the value of a current count property or field, which you can see is defined down here in code. So current count is 0. That is what will show up here. And then we have a button. And again, this is a standard HTML type of button, except rather than doing a standard on-click event that uses JavaScript, it uses @onClick, which tells the framework this is a piece of C# code. And it says when you click this button, call this increment count method. And the increment count method is down here. It just increments the counter. It will refresh this binding up here and will then show the value. So it's very, very simple in that sense. That's one of the great things about Blazor, is if you are familiar with any kind of recent .NET development, especially in ASP.NET, this is pretty straightforward to do, right? Not a lot of magic going on in the sense of what you have to build. The magic is all in being able to execute that on the browser. What's the name of the extension in Visual Studio Code? Somebody asks on that. Well, there is no real extension as such. You can just use standard Visual Studio Code. It's a standard .NET core project. So you use standard Visual Studio Code, you do .NET Run. Now there's some extensions that make it easier to debug, especially in combination with JavaScript. So you can download those extensions. But fundamentally, out of the box, Visual Studio Code is what you need. Well, you need the C# extension and stuff that you need for .NET development, but it's just the standard setup for that. I think you already answered the Blazor server versus client. So somebody asks, the DLLs would need to be on the client machine. How can you guarantee they are there? They are being loaded as part of your navigation to the page. So the bootstrapper, when you go to your Blazor app for the first time, it brings those DLLs across and puts them into a sandbox. So there's nothing special you have to do. It just takes care of it. Is there a plan to provide better guideline for someone who is migrating from Angular to this new world? Do you have to write from scratch? Well, the answer is yeah, you'll probably have to do a lot from scratch. And it's mostly companies like us that help you make that migration. So if you have any questions, take advantage of the free 1-hour consulting and we can then talk about it. And then there's a very good question. How can you localize a Blazor client app? Very, very good question. It uses standard .NET technologies for localization. I don't have a specific example about this today, but it works with resx files and it works with the browser languages. So you can do standard .NET localization through resx and resources, and that then works in the browser and it just switches with the browser language. essentially. So very, very nice model. Question, is it possible to separate C# and HTML? Absolutely, you can put your C# code into a separate file, you can put it into a separate DLL if you want. All that works. Although, in many cases, the code you have is actually pretty small because you tend to call, for anything meaningful, you tend to call other DLLs. So a lot of Blazor apps have the code right in line, but yeah, you can absolutely break it out as well. MVVM in Blazor, yes, you can use the MVVM model. It's just you make a, if I made, rather than this field here, I made a real class with the property, I could still bind to it here, right? So that would still work. IntelliSense fully supported, both in Visual Studio as well as Visual Studio Code. Callbacks to Signal are also supported. Everything that's supported in the browser is supported here as well. Local storage works as well. All right, another question. So yeah, the answer to, I see a lot of questions are about, does this web technology work or does that web technology work? And the answer is always yes, because it's standard web technologies. Okay, so that's the first example that we have here. And I want to show you a slightly different way of building these components. And that is, you can of course use the standard .NET CLI. So you can say .NET new Blazor WASM, that's the client-side thing, and we give it a name. We'll call it data.NET Blazor 2. And that is essentially what Visual Studio does behind the scenes. So you would do this if you're a Visual Studio Code developer. This is probably how you would create your Blazor client-side application, or server-side application for that matter. So this created this new data.NET Blazor 2 project, and we can now just do .NET Run or .NET Watch Run if you want, and then this compiles it, restores all the packages, fires it up. It's probably a little bit faster than Visual Studio all in all. More question, client-side database calls. I mean, you can do the database, the browser databases. You could theoretically also call to a SQL server if the IP address was open. Whether that's recommended is a different question. I would not, but you could call a database directly if you whitelisted the IPs. Intellectual property protection is the same as all other .NET, right? So it's .NET DLLs. You'll have to obfuscate if you're worried about somebody decompiling it. It's really the same as .NET everywhere. A lot of add-ons available. Yes, absolutely. There already are a lot of add-ons available already at this point. And the mobile devices, absolutely. Yeah, you can develop for mobile devices. You can do things like progressive web apps. You could do other things like a hybrid app and so on. But anyway, so this now just runs our web application spun up here on localhost. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go open another web browser here. And we're just going to navigate to this here. And you'll see that this is exactly the same, but created just low level in the CLI in .NET. And I could now open this and just do development in Visual Studio Code. And that's what I do a lot of times when I do something like this, actually, is I don't necessarily go to Visual Studio for the, unless I need specific Visual Studio features. So very, very straightforward and easy to do. I'm going to shut this down again for now, but absolutely can do this in VS Code, and that's a very, very common environment. Do you need to have Visual Studio 2019? Yes, I believe so. I've never tried it in 2017, but I think you need 2019. Although you could do a lot of low-level editing in .NET Run, I'm sure, in other versions of Visual Studio. It's pretty straightforward. AWS, can you deploy to Amazon? Absolutely. Again, it's just the standard web technology. If you ran on an intranet, yeah, you could call SQL Server directly, and that will probably be a lot safer. But technically, absolutely doable. Okay, so that's Blazor on the client side. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I'm going to show you briefly that you can do the same exact thing on the server side, right? So when I did the new project, where you pick your Blazor template, or even in the command line, here is the next step. You could simply choose to create a Blazor server-side app. Okay, so I could pick Blazor server here, and again, it's going to run for a moment, and you'll see that the code is practically identical, and the execution will be practically identical. Okay, so here's our Blazor server app, and you see that this is pretty much the same thing, right? We still have our counter and the code is identical. Here now, if we were to look into startup.cs, that would be where the changes are. It configures it to run server-side. Now people always ask, can I just switch back and forth? And the answer is yes, you can, but there's no tooling for that, right? But so what you'd have to do is you'd have to bring in this type of code on your own that would switch the client side to server side execution. So yes, you can switch back and forth, but it's not totally automated. But at the end of the day, if we were to run this now, you would see almost no difference until you actually looked into the under the hood stuff, because now there's no DLLs traveling to the client anymore. And if you watch the actual HTTP traffic, you would see that every time we click the counter button, it actually counts up and so on. Okay, again, another question, OAuth, OpenID, it's all supported. Some of it is actually built in. You can do some multi-threading, yes. So, yeah, you see it's the same pattern all the time, right? All these standard technologies are pretty much supported. So here's our Blazor server-side app, and I can click this button, and you can see it still goes very, very fast. But yeah, if I had a slow connection, we'd probably start seeing more of a difference. And if we were to look into the actual dev tools here and looked at what came across on the network tab, get that maximized and refreshed, you would see that, you know, it doesn't bring as much across. It's really mostly CSS or only CSS and HTML type of stuff. So that's the difference between server side. Again, the code's very similar. You will see differences in terms of how you access data. So that's where the flipping the switch usually starts breaking down a little bit. But those are more logical programming things, not so much technological things. Is there extensive help? Yes, there's I mean, there could always be more help and documentation, but if you go to blazor.net, you'll find a lot. Somebody's asking about client-side security. That's a really good question, right? In .NET, you can just say modify the registry with a little bit of C# code, or access this or that file. You are limited in that, right? You could not just change the registry. So it runs in a secure sandbox, just like JavaScript does. So yeah, you'll see some things like in code reuse, you may be bringing in a DLL that's trying to do some things that are just security-wise not allowed. So it's secure in that sense. And what if we had multiple people hit the same website and click that counter button? It would work as expected. Even on the server-side version, it knows to keep the state and keep things straight. Okay, let's talk a little bit about components. Let's go back to our prior app that we created, Stata.NET Blazor app. And you'll notice that there already are some components in there. Okay, so you'll see things like on the home page, where is the index razor page. It says hello, and you know, how are you doing? And then it has this component in here that does a survey prompt, which basically shows you some information about, hey, how do you like Blazor and so on. This is in itself another razor page, so we could go and look at where that is, survey prompt. Well, there's a survey prompt.razor, and that makes for a component, right? So this component, just because of the fact that there's a survey prompt.razor, you have that as a component that you can use as an HTML tag somewhere else. And this has, again, some standard razor stuff, some HTML, some embedded C# expressions. And then it has a little bit of code here. In this case, it just defines a property called title, and it uses the parameter attribute to say, hey, this is something that you can set on your component. And in fact, if we were to look back into index.razor, you see we have a title attribute, the title property set here that gets passed into the component. So very, very straightforward, simple component model. And we could take this a step further, right? We could say, let's just add our own component here. And you see there's integration here into Visual Studio. It shows you the right thing. And we'll just call this our events component because we are at a state of .NET event. So I'll call it events. I can then say I want this to be a routable thing. So we can say up here at the top, we can use the page directive, and we can say this is our /events component. And then we can put stuff in here. We can put code in here. I could go ahead now and I could call a .NET component. In fact, I already made a project ahead of time, so you don't have to watch me do this, where I'm going through that. And I see there's a lot of questions. I'll try to get to more of those questions later because we still got a lot of stuff to go through. But here's essentially this same basic startup project. And here is that Razor page. And what I did in here is I added an outside dependency. And in this case, I made it a NuGet package. I added a reference to this event loader NuGet package that I have. And those of you who've seen me do presentations in the past, you may have seen me use this component. This component is just a .NET component. It has nothing to do with Razor. It's just a simple component that can talk to a data source of some sort and bring back a list of events. And events are things like, you know, the Stata.NET event, the training class, things that we as a company put on as live events or online events. And so I brought that in. Again, nothing to do with Razor, just a standard .NET component. And I then said in here, okay, when this component initializes, so this is a standard method that Razor offers me up, then go and use that event loader and get the names of the 25 most recent or random 25 events. And it puts it into this field here that's just a list of strings. Okay? And I also have a parameter of how I can use this component. And then up here, I just do an unordered list, do a for each, and I display the name of these events. So let's fire this up here. And yeah, this question line, can you do interaction input output between different components? Yeah, absolutely. You can pass these parameters around. It essentially works like you'd expect it to, right? If you couldn't do that, then it'd be relatively useless. So yeah, absolutely, you can do that. Yeah, you could communicate up with the parent. Can you use reflection? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I have to look that up. I do know that reflection emit doesn't work. So that's just a security limitation. I'm not totally sure you can use reflection. I'd have to check that out. But anyway, so here's that app. I can now go to /events because we made that events component in that sense. And I did it manually here, so it re-navigates to it. And it does, I have caching disabled, it takes a moment. Or I could, of course, just navigate around here and it would just load it in place. And here's our list of events. And the significance of this is, think about this for a moment. We are using a non-Blazor, just a regular old .NET DLL to serve up this data. And it runs on the client. This DLL is now deployed to the client and it runs there. Okay. Now, because I made this a component, I can't just go to it through the /events, but I also went into the index page here where we looked at that survey prompt before, and I added my component in here too. I also have a title attribute, and that is why I can go to the home page here and I see my same list of events executed here as an inline components. Questions, is there open source components for Blazor? Yes, the open source community is very, very active. So we'll take a look at the debugging here in a moment. In fact, that might actually be my next demo here. Here we go. So debugging in Blazor essentially just works. So there's a few different things you can do. So let's go to our counter page here, for instance, and let's just let's comment this out for a moment here. And let's put a breakpoint here. So we're putting a breakpoint into Visual Studio and we're going to run this thing again. Now what happens is this is going to deploy into the browser again. So the browser is in essence a remote machine, if you want to think of it like that. But Visual Studio wires everything up to make remote debugging into that remote environment work. So as we go in here and this loads up, you'll see in a moment, come on. There we go. And again, these performance characteristics are really bad right now because I'm doing a remote presentation. I have all kinds of screen sharing tools running. When you do that, it'll be much faster. So here's our app running and, whoops, didn't hit. Now this breakpoint is not, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit for my next demo. But if I had done this correctly, let's see if it doesn't work right now. But if you do this at home, I'm not going to go through the motions of making this work right now, but if you do this at home, it would actually just work, right? So you'll see that. Now, the reason it doesn't work is I'm actually getting ahead of myself a little bit here, because there's two different ways of how you can debug it. You can either do that, or if you run it in the browser, you can enable a mode where you can actually debug it right in the browser. So let's run that. And by the way, from Visual Studio Code, the debugging also works the same way fundamentally, right? So you can launch a debugger in Visual Studio Code and it'll also work from there. But so now what I want to do is, once this loads, go back into my counter here, and I'm gonna bring up the dev tools. And somehow I'm running a mode that doesn't quite work here. Yeah, I actually have to apologize here. The way I have my environment set here, I guess I just broke my debugging demo. But the point is, and you'll just have to trust me on this for now, I apologize for that, but you can hit Shift-Alt-D, right, when the application has focus. So if I click somewhere over here, I can hit Shift-Alt-D, and this will bring up this other browser, and it'll say in here, okay, you can debug this code, but you have to first enable it. And depending on what browser you use, you have to run a different command here first. And it's a little bit difficult to demo because you're setting it up the first time, right? And then it works. So I'm gonna copy this, Control C, and then I'm just gonna run that in my prompt, and I have it up here. Okay, and then once you do that, it launches this new mode here that'll be up in a moment, I hope. And somehow I broke my demo. But the point is, once you do that, and you have it set up and you don't do this demo 15 times ahead of time and break it while you're at it like I just did, you can actually debug right in the development environment. So you'll see another source here. So just like you would see things like JavaScript files like this, you will then actually see your C# file, and you can debug right in here. So I apologize for this demo not working. It's a little bit tricky to set up because you have to enable it, and you want to show that in a demo. And so, but that's a really, really cool feature, is being able to debug both inside your dev environment or right inside your browser. So what else do we have? How is there a limit to the total size of the DLL served? No, it just will take longer if you have bigger DLLs. How does the observable model work compared to React? It's a two-way data binding, so it's true data binding rather than the one-way model in React. Okay, so that's the slightly botched debugging demo, but you get the idea, right? That's how it will work for you. Another important topic is JavaScript interop. You can't just do your .NET code, but you can absolutely call out to JavaScript code. So in this example here, I'm using this JS runtime object, which I'm injecting here using dependency injection, which works very well with Blazor. So you can then use this JS runtime object to invoke any method, and it can have a return type. In this case, it's made a JavaScript function that returns a string. The function is called hello. I can pass parameters to it. And so now I just have to define this function somewhere. It could be in a JavaScript file. In my case, I was lazy. I just stuck it into the index HTML file. So here's that function. It's just regular JavaScript, right? So we have this function here. And I can just call that from my natively executing C# code. Of course, that only works if we are on the client. But this is a pretty important thing, because this is what enables you to mix and match all the stuff together. So question is, how do we do unit tests if we mix and match JavaScript and HTML and C#? Well, the unit testing, you would break it out into separate classes, into separate DLLs. So I would still assume that your architecture makes it so that everything that's meaningful that needs testing is still a separate file, right? So that's absolutely still recommended, is to have those two things broken out. And then unit testing would just work like always. Can you access local resources? Well, you couldn't just reach out into the file system and load everything you wanted, but you could do stuff in the sandbox. Okay, so here is that example again. If I click this, it now counts up the counter, but it also calls into the JavaScript, and you see that it passed along a value to JavaScript, and we'd actually get a value back and so on. And then it still increments the counter. So that's JavaScript interop, very, very straightforward. Really relatively easy to do if you look at it. And that's kind of the theme in Blazor that I really like. It's all in all pretty interesting, pretty straightforward to do. Now, one of the things that we haven't really talked about yet is progressive web apps. Those are the apps that you can install as standalone on your environment. Now, looking at this app that we created, let me shut this one down again, and let's get back to the one that we just created in this sample here. Stata.net Blazor app. Can somebody online ask, so you wouldn't save settings into the registry? That's correct. So if you have any settings you need to store, you could put it into local storage or something like that. Again, it's standard .web technologies, right? Really messed up my debug environment here. Do this. There we go. Does Rider support Blazor? Yeah, absolutely. It's just a .NET Core project as far as that goes. And somebody asked about local storage. Local storage is this way to basically put stuff into a storage that the browser maintains for you. You can access it from JavaScript, you can access it from this stuff. Be happy to follow up with that after the talk. So here we go, we're starting up our app again. File upload scenario, I have to be honest, I haven't tried a file upload in Blazor. I believe you can just, parts of the file system you can use. So you could use up you could show your own dialogues, or you could interop with JavaScript, of course. What do you suppose is the greatest risk with Blazor as far as me selling it to paying clients go? I think it's just a perception, right? Do you want to buy into a Microsoft technology for web development after what Silverlight has done to people? I think that's the biggest thing. That was the biggest fear we had with Blazor, to be honest, but it seems that fear was unfounded as we see a lot of momentum behind it. Can you do everything without JavaScript? Probably not, but the majority of things you can do. Okay, so this is loading very slowly as I messed up my debug environment, but it will come up eventually. See what other questions we have. Will Microsoft continue to support both versions of Blazor? Yes, absolutely. There's already a roadmap for, and I have a slide about that, for going forward into the .NET 5 and .NET 6 timeframe. So, got that. Dependency injection supported, that was another question I see there. And man, this is really taking a long time here. Make sure it's not stuck anywhere. Come on. Guess I shouldn't have tried to do the debug sample. Anyway, this will come up eventually, I'm sure. What other questions do we have? Database is from the client. I think we already answered that. If you're on the server, so if you're doing server side, yes, you have access to your database, so you can just do that. I'm gonna shut this down one more time and restart it. I think we answered most questions. Does an install PWA give you access to components on the computer? It's still the same sandbox. You're still operating in the same security environment. Interop in the local storage should work directly, and yes, you should be able to debug it from the client. Am I aware of any commercial sites using Blazor? I don't have an answer for that. I'd have to look that up. I'm sure there's some. I know that Microsoft themselves are using it, but I don't know who else is using it. It's not information that's typically easily available. I don't know. This is taking a long time. Maybe we'll come back later to this. Somehow I messed up my debugging experience. So let's talk for a moment about Blazor third-party components. I think that's relatively important. There's quite a number of companies, and I put up a few different slides here, that are already providing Blazor components, and you can go and download it from their applications. I do have an example here of something that we built internally at EPS, and that is has to do with COVID. It's a public website that you can get to. It's covid19compare.xyz, and I have to say thank you to one of my employees, Dr. Otto Dobritzberger, who is a PhD in genetics and does stuff related to things like viruses. And so he wrote himself this web application here where he's able to go in and say, I want to compare different countries and say the confirmed count of COVID infections. And there was no site out there that allowed you to compare the different countries. So like, let's say you want to compare two European countries, Austria and Sweden, and see how their different strategies worked out. And let's give this a different color. And so it uses these charts here that are vector-based charts based on standard web technologies, but they are actually a component from a third party. So this is a DevExpress component. You can go to this right now and try it out. And this is just a component that DevExpress provides as a commercial component that you can put into your Blazor application and go through and compare, how well is the Swedish approach to this epidemic working out to some of the more successful countries that are doing it. And there's different ways of doing this side by side, and it's really nice how these components just work out of the box. I don't know if you can really see that well online. They're animated and show the data in very nice ways. And so that's just one example of third-party components that are out there that you can use and then that make Blazor development a lot faster and a lot easier. And we'll probably write an article about this particular website in an upcoming issue of Code Magazine, so you will see that as well. So again, there's a lot of third parties out there that do this. There's also a very big open source community at this point. So all these are open source initiatives that provide Blazor components. Now let's go back to this other example here one more time. Let's shut this down. Let's see if we can launch this without the debugger attached. If it even wants to shut down at this point. There we go. Okay, and so this is now loading properly, and you can already see that up here in the address bar there's this little plus icon. And basically what happened is, because in the very beginning when we created this Blazor app, I checked the box that I wanted to make this available as a progressive web app. The framework automatically adds everything by default to make this a PWA. And we could actually mess with that and change it completely, but out of the box it'll just work. So I can now say install this as a PWA, and now you see that this runs just as a standalone PWA application, it is also installed in the start menu. So now we could launch it from here. This would also work on phones. So this could now become an app that runs on your phone. And we could go in here and we could click around and do all the same stuff. And this now works much more like you would expect a typical Windows application to work, right? So it becomes a typical PWA, very, very interesting technology that can run standalone on Windows, Mac, Linux. It can also install on a mobile phone. Then it would look more like this here. And yeah, it just works out of the box, right? Very, very interesting functionality that makes it very nice to essentially almost build like a rich desktop application using Blazor and web technologies. Is the Excel app in the browser? How is that done? Is that WebAssembly? I don't think so, but I don't know that for sure. But I believe that's just JavaScript. Are the DevExpress components specific for Blazor? Yes, they're specific Blazor components. I don't know how they bundle them into their subscription, assuming it'll be probably part of that, but it's specific components to Blazor. Now here's a very interesting question. Are there any WYSIWYG editors available for Blazor? And the answer is no, and Microsoft currently has no plans to do so. In simple terms, it just, over the way it has developed over the last years, it's turned out that doing web development with UI designers is not really working out well. It's just too complex a scenario, too many different things to consider. So developers haven't been using them, and so Microsoft hasn't made any plans to do a WYSIWYG type of editing experience. Now they say if there's enough feedback that people want that, they may think about it, but right now the official statement is no, they're not doing it. All right, we already talked a little bit about the future of Blazor. It's in the .NET 5, 6 and beyond roadmap, so it'll be a core component of all that. So it's important to understand that Microsoft's doing that for future support. So this is certainly a very well supported major feature that Microsoft plans to use. And this pretty much brings us to the end of this presentation. Again, I can only scratch the surface of what's possible with Blazor, but I'm hoping I've given you the idea that this is very, very exciting technology that supplements a lot of the other stuff that's out there. It's not for everything, but certainly a .NET developer who is interested in building a rich web application, that's a really good case for Blazor. And we are using it internally. We're going to use it a lot going forward. Starting to look into it for development for customers. It's a really exciting development, and it's exciting to me that the community is really taking to it. So just a few other announcements. Again, please help us out with this survey, tinyurl.com/codeblazor. It's only 9 questions. Takes you less than a minute to fill out. Would really help us a lot. You're also, if you were part of this presentation, getting a free subscription, a 6-month subscription to Code Magazine, just free of charge, unless you tell us you don't want that, then we won't, but most people want it, so we always do that. Again, take advantage of your free consulting hour. I see there's a lot of questions, even some questions I wasn't able to answer. I think I've gotten them most. I'll stick around for a little bit longer looking at the questions further up that I didn't get to so far. But if you have any in-depth questions, like how does this work for my specific project, we are more than happy to set up a free hour of consulting. Also, on a different announcement, we have a new mobile app for Code Magazine. We are doing a Corona special while this crisis is going on. If you have any subscription to Code Magazine, you're getting all our content for free. And if you don't have a subscription Code Magazine, there is a link on the page that gives you a free subscription as well. So this is all free, just a special we're doing while people are stuck at home during this Corona crisis, so you can at least learn and read a lot of content. And by the way, if you are a Microsoft customer, you have the VSS subscription for my MSDN application package subscription, or you're just a Dev Essentials customer, which is the free stuff. We have a partnership with Microsoft that also gives you a free subscription. Pass that on. No strings attached, just a free subscription to Code Magazine. So that's it for the announcements. We do have the next Data.NET event planned already. The next Data.NET event will be on July 29th, similar to today. And that is going to focus on the Amazon cloud, AWS, and how .NET developers and others, but it's from a .NET developer angle, how you can use the Amazon cloud and what all the features are, or at least an overview of the features on that. So it should be a pretty interesting presentation. We've gotten a lot of feedback that people want to hear that, so that'll be the Stata.net for July. And with that, I'll end the main part of the presentation. I'm going to open it for more Q&A. And for the rest of you, thank you very much for attending. Hope you liked it. Please fill out our survey. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Tell your friends about it. And other than that, stay safe and happy coding with Blazor. Thank you very much. So for the other questions, there's a few more questions. Is this or that made with Blazor? I really don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. Let's go up a little further in your list. In our list, we did answer the databases from the client, security. Yep, I think I pretty much got all the questions that we had further up in that. Is the technology mature enough? I would say so. It's been in use internally at Microsoft for a long time. I think it's absolutely ready for production development, both enterprise as well as others. I don't know what the Sun Blazor server-side app is, unfortunately. Can you obfuscate the client-side code? Yeah, it's .NET DLL, right? So all the obfuscation tools will work. How well does Blazor scale? Well, especially the Blazor client-side stuff scales super well, because all you're doing is you're loading static files to the client, and then it all runs on the client. So you can use even static Azure web apps and scale that up insanely high with very little effort, because it's really just static page loading. So, and then it's actually running on the client. Now, if you do server-side stuff, well, it scales like an ASP.NET MVC app would, basically. Can I recommend a better debugging or an exception handling experience? Actually, the debugging experience, if my demo would have worked, is really good. It's the debugging experience is basically you can do both .NET debugging in VS Code and Visual Studio, so it's the regular debugging experience with everything that offers, or you can debug right in the browser. Unfortunately, my demo didn't work for that because I was going back and forth on the configuration on that, but trust me, at home this will work, and you have some very good debugging experience. So it's not like echoing out lines and stuff. I mean, you can do that, but the debugging experience is really good. Client security, I think we attached. And some of the components are open source that third parties provide, but not everything, right? It's up to each vendor to say it's open source or not. Do we use Webpack to build? No, you're using just the Blazor system. So the Blazor system does all the stuff you need. It does the tree shaking. It, especially in a deployment build, it compiles it down much smaller than you saw in my environment. So you don't need to do any Webpack. But of course, if you combined it with JavaScript, then you'd still do your minification, and then you could combine it with that. But you don't need it for just Blazor. So I think that's it for the questions. Thank you very much. I hope to see you all next month when we talk about AWS. And for those of you further questions, like I said, consider us a resource. Feel free to contact us. We're not the kind of company that's going to send